They laughed because they thought they were looking at an old car. They fell silent because they finally realized they were looking at an extraordinary man. The late afternoon sun hung low over Blackstone Speedway in western Montana, painting the rows of polished trailers and custom race haulers in shades of gold. Engines growled across the paddock like restless thunder, while the scent of racing fuel mixed with grilled burgers and fresh-cut grass drifted through the warm summer air. Families gathered behind safety fences, children balanced on their fathers' shoulders, and cameras followed every expensive machine rolling toward the starting grid. Then, almost unnoticed, an aging dark blue 1969 Chevrolet Chevelle eased through the entrance gate with a soft rumble that sounded completely out of place among the gleaming supercharged monsters surrounding it. Its faded paint reflected years instead of trophies. Its chrome carried tiny scratches earned from honest work rather than showroom lights. Behind the wheel sat Nathan Brooks, a 41-year-old single father whose weathered hands rested lightly on the steering wheel as though the car were an old friend instead of a race machine. Beside him, his 10-year-old daughter Emily smiled with the quiet excitement only children could hold on to before the world tried to teach them doubt. She hugged a worn backpack against her chest and looked toward the grandstands with wide blue eyes. "Dad," she whispered, "there are so many people." Nathan answered with the same calm smile he always wore. "They're here for the race, sweetheart. Let's just enjoy the day." The moment they parked near the end of the pit lane, conversations began to drift toward them. One mechanic glanced at the Chevelle before shaking his head with a chuckle. Another folded his arms and laughed openly. "Is that thing actually racing?" someone called. "Maybe it's here for the classic car show," another voice answered, drawing louder laughter from the nearby crowd. Nathan simply opened the driver's door, climbed out, and gently helped Emily onto the pavement. He ignored every comment the way a man ignores rain after surviving storms. Emily looked up at him for reassurance. "They're laughing at us." Nathan knelt beside her until they were eye level. People usually laugh when they don't know the whole story. Before she could reply, a bright red performance car rolled into the neighboring pit. Victor Hayes stepped out wearing a spotless racing suit covered in sponsor logos, flashing the confident grin of a man accustomed to cameras and applause. He looked Nathan's Chevelle up and down before smirking. "You actually brought that antique onto my track?" A few spectators laughed again. Victor shrugged dramatically. "Well, I guess every race needs comic relief." Nathan closed the Chevelle's hood without saying a word. His silence somehow unsettled more people than an argument would have. From across the paddock, Claire Bennett, owner of Bennett Performance Racing, happened to glance toward the exchange. She barely noticed Victor's jokes. Her attention stayed on the old Chevelle. Something about the engine bay she had glimpsed while Nathan unloaded his tools refused to leave her mind. It wasn't the car's appearance that caught her attention. It was the impossibly clean craftsmanship hidden beneath decades of dust. Nathan climbed back into the driver's seat to move the car toward technical inspection. He turned the ignition key. For one heartbeat, the entire paddock sounded exactly as it had before. Then the Chevelle's engine came alive with a deep, perfectly balanced roar unlike anything else at Blackstone Speedway. It wasn't the loudest engine anyone had ever heard. It was something far rarer. It sounded precise, disciplined, purposeful. Conversations stopped in the middle of sentences. Experienced mechanics slowly turned their heads. Claire's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. Somewhere in the growing silence, one elderly engine builder quietly removed his cap and whispered, "That can't be possible." The unexpected sound lingered over Blackstone Speedway long after the engine settled into a smooth idle. It was not louder than the others. It was cleaner, almost musical, the kind of mechanical harmony that only came from thousands of careful decisions made by hands that respected every bolt and every fraction of an inch. Claire Bennett remained perfectly still as Nathan guided the Chevelle toward the inspection lane. Around her, conversations slowly returned, but they no longer carried the easy confidence they had only moments before. One gray-haired inspector folded his clipboard under his arm and quietly muttered, "Whoever built that motor knows exactly what they are doing." His younger assistant frowned. "Maybe he just got lucky." The older man shook his head. "Luck does not sound like that." Nathan parked beside the inspection tent and switched off the ignition. Emily climbed out carrying a small canvas tool bag that looked almost too heavy for her. Before Nathan could reach for it, she smiled. I have got it, Dad. He smiled back. I know you do. Together they walked toward registration while teams around them unloaded computers worth thousands of dollars, polished spare wheels, and stacks of expensive racing tires. Nathan carried only a weathered metal toolbox with chipped blue paint and a folded camping chair. Emily carried a small cooler packed with homemade sandwiches and bottled water. They looked less like a professional racing team and more like a father and daughter enjoying a Saturday together. At the registration table, a volunteer scanned Nathan's paperwork before raising an eyebrow. First time racing here? Nathan nodded politely. Yes, ma'am. She handed him his number decal. Well, good luck. You will probably need it. Nathan thanked her with the same quiet kindness he offered everyone. Emily waited until they stepped away before whispering, She thinks we cannot win. Nathan placed the decal carefully on the Chevelle's door before answering. Winning is not the first reason we came. Emily tilted her head. Then why did we come? He looked across the speedway where dozens of fathers were taking photographs with their children beside shiny race cars. Because I promised you that someday we would build something together that we could both be proud of. Emily smiled without saying another word. Across the paddock, Victor Hayes watched the exchange through the windshield of his own car. His crew chief crossed his arms. Do you want us to check out that old Chevelle? Victor laughed and adjusted his racing gloves. There is nothing to check. Sentiment does not make a car fast. Yet his eyes drifted back toward Nathan longer than he intended. Claire had not moved very far either. She found herself studying the old Chevelle from across the lane. Something continued to bother her, not in a bad way, but like a puzzle she had almost solved years ago. The routing of the exhaust, the handcrafted intake pieces, the unusual balance of the idle. Every detail suggested an engineer who understood performance at the deepest level but had chosen simplicity over attention. She slowly walked toward the technical inspection area, just as officials asked Nathan to raise the hood. Several mechanics leaned closer out of curiosity. One by one, their casual expressions disappeared. Nobody spoke for several long seconds. Finally, an inspector looked up at Nathan and asked softly, Did you build this engine yourself? Nathan nodded once. Yes, sir. The inspector glanced back into the engine compartment as though searching for an explanation hidden somewhere beneath polished steel. Claire felt her heartbeat quicken. She had seen workmanship like this only once before, many years earlier, in engineering journals and championship garages. The name escaped her memory, but the signature was unmistakable. Whoever this quiet single father really was, he had not come to Blackstone Speedway by accident. The qualifying session began beneath a cloudless Montana sky as the public address system echoed across Blackstone Speedway. Drivers climbed into machines that gleamed beneath the afternoon sun, while spectators searched the starting grid for familiar names. Nathan Brooks quietly fastened his helmet, adjusted his gloves, and looked toward the passenger fence where Emily stood beside the old camping chair, holding a small notebook filled with hand-drawn sketches of the Chevelle. She noticed him looking her way and raised one thumb with a confident smile. Nathan answered with a small nod before lowering the visor. Around him, high-horsepower engines barked impatiently, each one demanding attention. His Chevelle remained almost peaceful by comparison, idling with calm confidence instead of noisy aggression. Drivers, prepare for qualifying, the announcer called. Tires rolled toward the staging lane one after another until Victor Hayes pulled alongside Nathan. He lowered his window with a grin that invited another audience. Do not worry if you finish last, he said loudly enough for nearby crews to hear. At least your daughter will learn that showing up matters. Several people laughed again, although the laughter sounded thinner than before. Nathan simply looked ahead. She already knows what matters, he replied. Victor waited for more, perhaps an insult or an excuse, but none came. The silence unsettled him far more than any argument could have. The green signal illuminated, and the first qualifying cars accelerated onto the oval. Lap after lap, digital timing boards flashed impressive numbers while fans cheered every new leader. When Nathan's turn arrived, many spectators expected little more than a sentimental parade lap. The Chevelle rolled smoothly onto the racing surface, gathering speed with quiet determination. Nathan guided the car through the opening corners with remarkable patience, never forcing the steering wheel, never chasing the throttle. His first lap appeared almost ordinary. The timing board placed him near the middle of the field. A group of teenagers in the grandstands shrugged with disappointment. "I told you," one of them said. "It is just an old car." Emily heard the comment, but kept her eyes fixed on the track. She remembered countless evenings inside their small garage, where her father measured tiny engine components under warm shop lights while old country music played softly from a dusty radio. He always repeated the same lesson. Speed comes from patience before it comes from power. Claire Bennett folded her arms as she watched the monitor displaying live telemetry supplied by race officials. Something immediately caught her attention. Nathan was braking earlier than everyone else, entering every corner slower than necessary, yet somehow carrying perfect balance through the exit. His steering inputs were almost invisible. His engine never sounded strained. Every movement appeared deliberate, almost restrained. Standing beside her, an experienced crew engineer frowned at the data. "He is holding back." Claire looked at him. "How can you tell?" The engineer pointed toward the screen. "Because nobody drives that clean by accident. He is learning the track, not attacking it." On Nathan's final qualifying lap, the Chevelle glided through the last corner with the same composed rhythm before crossing the finish line. The scoreboard placed him in the middle of the starting order. Around the grandstands, applause remained polite but brief. Victor laughed inside his helmet as he glanced at the rankings. "Exactly where he belongs," he muttered. Nathan returned calmly to the pit lane, removed his helmet, and thanked the track marshal who directed him into his parking space. Emily ran toward him with bright eyes. "Was that your fastest?" she asked. Nathan accepted the bottle of water she handed him and smiled gently. "No, sweetheart." She looked surprised. "Then why did you not go faster?" Nathan glanced toward the crowded grandstands before answering in his quiet voice. "Because the race is tomorrow. Today was only about listening." Claire overheard those final words from several feet away, and for reasons she could not yet explain, she realized she was no longer watching an underdog trying to keep up. She was watching a man who seemed to know something that everyone else at Blackstone Speedway had completely missed. The evening settled gently over Blackstone Speedway as the last rays of sunlight stretched across the empty grandstands. Most teams had already returned to their luxury trailers where laptops glowed through tinted windows and engineers debated charts filled with numbers. Nathan Brooks remained beside the old Chevelle with only a small work light hanging beneath the raised hood. The warm yellow glow reflected from polished aluminum and carefully organized tools that had clearly served him for many years. Emily sat nearby on the folding chair, swinging her feet while finishing the last bite of a peanut butter sandwich. Crickets had begun singing beyond the fences, blending with the distant hum of generators that powered the paddock through the night. Nathan tightened one small fitting, paused, listened to the engine breathe through an electronic diagnostic headset, then smiled almost imperceptibly. He reached into the toolbox and selected a tiny screwdriver instead of a larger wrench. Emily watched with familiar curiosity. "Is something broken?" she asked quietly. Nathan shook his head. "No, sweetheart. Sometimes something good only needs a little patience to become even better." Across the lane, several mechanics noticed the unusual scene. One of them frowned as Nathan removed a small electronic control module no larger than a paperback novel. Without opening a laptop or connecting expensive software, he carefully adjusted several tiny calibration switches hidden beneath its protective cover before reinstalling it with steady hands. "What is he doing?" a younger mechanic whispered. An older technician narrowed his eyes. "That is not guessing," he answered. "He knows exactly what every adjustment will do." Claire Bennett had been reviewing her own team's setup sheets when she happened to glance through the open doorway of her trailer. Her attention immediately returned to Nathan. She walked closer without making a sound, stopping several yards away where she could observe without interrupting. She watched him start the engine once more. The Chevelle settled into a perfectly even idle that barely disturbed the cool evening air. Nathan closed his eyes for several seconds, listening instead of looking. Then he reached beneath the dashboard and made one final adjustment with nothing more than his fingertips. The idle changed so slightly that most people would never have noticed, but Claire heard it instantly. The vibration disappeared. The engine seemed almost to relax. She quietly exhaled. "Impossible," she whispered to herself. One of her senior engineers joined her. "Do you recognize him?" Claire slowly shook her head. "No, but I recognize the philosophy." The engineer looked puzzled. Claire continued watching Nathan. Every modification serves three purposes instead of one. Reliability, balance, efficiency. Somebody taught him to think that way years ago. Meanwhile, Victor Hayes stepped out of his climate-controlled trailer carrying a sports drink and immediately spotted the small crowd beginning to gather around Nathan's pit. He walked over with an amused smile. "Still tuning that museum piece?" he asked. Nathan looked up from the engine bay and answered with complete sincerity. "Just making sure everything is ready." Victor laughed. "You cannot polish yesterday into tomorrow." Nathan simply closed the hood with a gentle click. "Maybe not," he replied. "But you can take good care of something that has never stopped believing in tomorrow." Victor rolled his eyes before walking away, convinced he had won another exchange. Yet several nearby mechanics remained where they stood, their attention fixed on the Chevelle instead of the departing favorite. One elderly engine builder slowly approached Nathan after Victor disappeared. He removed his glasses and looked carefully at the handwritten notes resting on the workbench. Every measurement had been recorded neatly in pencil over many years. At the bottom corner of one weathered page sat a small handwritten signature. The old builder stared at it for several long seconds before his eyes widened with quiet disbelief. He looked back at Nathan, then at the signature once more, and spoke so softly that only the night seemed to hear him. "I knew I had seen this workmanship before. You are the engineer everyone thought had walked away from racing forever." Race morning arrived beneath a clear blue Montana sky, and Blackstone Speedway awakened with the unmistakable energy that only competition could bring. Flags fluttered gently above packed grandstands while the aroma of fresh coffee, grilled breakfast sandwiches, and warm asphalt drifted through the cool morning air. Engines echoed from every corner of the paddock as crews hurried through final inspections, checking tire pressures, tightening suspension bolts, and reviewing race strategies one last time. Nathan Brooks followed a much quieter routine. He wiped a light layer of dust from the Chevelle with a clean cotton cloth before kneeling beside the front wheel to verify each lug nut by hand. Emily stood nearby wearing a faded blue baseball cap much too large for her head, carefully reading each item from a handwritten checklist. "Fuel level is good," she said proudly. Nathan smiled. "Good. Oil temperature is ready. Good. Water bottles are packed." Nathan looked at her with gentle appreciation. "That might be the most important one." She laughed softly, and for a brief moment the noise of the speedway seemed far away. Across the paddock, Victor Hayes stood surrounded by cameras as reporters eagerly asked about his chances of winning another trophy. "We have prepared for this race all year," he declared confidently. "Experience usually beats dreams." One reporter pointed toward Nathan's pit. "What do you think about the newcomer everyone has been talking about?" Victor barely glanced in that direction. "Interesting story. Wrong race." The interview ended with comfortable laughter, but Claire Bennett noticed something Victor failed to see. Nathan never once looked toward the cameras. His attention never wandered from Emily or the Chevelle. It was as though public opinion carried no weight inside his world. Drivers were soon called to the starting grid. The field rolled into position beneath bright sunshine as thousands of spectators stood to capture photographs with their phones. Nathan's Chevelle settled quietly into its assigned starting position near the middle of the lineup. Emily waited behind the safety barrier where families gathered before the race. She caught her father's attention and placed one hand over her heart. It had become their silent tradition after Nathan's wife, and Emily's mother, had passed away years earlier. It meant only one thing: come home safely. Nathan returned the gesture with a small smile before lowering his visor. Moments later, the command to start engines echoed through the loudspeakers. One after another, powerful motors roared to life until the entire speedway vibrated beneath a chorus of horsepower. Yet Nathan's engine still possessed that unmistakable balance which caused experienced mechanics to pause whenever it spoke. Claire found herself listening to it instead of watching the scoreboard. "It is almost effortless," she murmured. Her chief engineer nodded slowly. "Machines usually reflect the people who build them." As the pace car guided the field through the opening formation laps, drivers warmed their tires and tested their brakes. Victor aggressively accelerated and slowed several times, eager to remind everyone of his confidence. Nathan maintained a steady distance, never reacting, never competing before the race had truly begun. One commentator laughed over the public address system. Our newcomer certainly seems relaxed back there. Another announcer answered thoughtfully. Or perhaps he simply knows that patience has its own kind of speed. Claire looked toward Nathan once more, remembering the old builder's words from the previous evening. She quietly walked to the registration office and requested a copy of the driver information sheet. Her eyes moved down the page until they reached one line that made her breathing stop for an instant. Years earlier, she had studied engineering articles written by a brilliant designer whose revolutionary ideas had suddenly disappeared from professional racing after a family tragedy. She slowly looked back toward the Chevelle waiting behind the pace car. "Nathan Brooks," she whispered. "It really is you." At that exact moment, the pace car turned into pit lane. The green flag rose into the bright morning air, and the race that everyone believed would crown another predictable champion finally began. The opening laps unfolded with remarkable discipline as the field settled into its natural rhythm beneath the bright Montana sun. Tires hummed against the smooth racing surface while the grandstands pulsed with excitement every time the leaders swept past the finish line. Victor Hayes quickly established himself near the front, driving with the confidence everyone expected. Television cameras followed his bright red machine as commentators praised his aggressive pace and polished technique. Farther back, Nathan Brooks guided the old Chevelle with almost surprising restraint. He never forced a pass that was not there. He never chased another driver's mistake. Instead, he allowed the car to breathe through every corner, preserving momentum with smooth precision that only a handful of experienced observers truly appreciated. Claire Bennett stood high above pit lane inside the timing tower, studying every lap on the monitor. "He is still holding something back," she quietly said. Her chief engineer nodded without taking his eyes off the data. "His tire temperatures are lower than everyone else's. His fuel consumption is better too. He is racing for the second half, not the first." Emily watched from the family viewing area with both hands wrapped around the fence. Every time the Chevelle appeared, she counted softly under her breath before smiling to herself. She knew the sound of her father's engine better than anyone in the world, and each lap carried the same calm heartbeat she had heard so many evenings inside their small garage. Near lap 20, excitement suddenly rippled through the crowd as one of the younger drivers experienced a mechanical problem entering the back straightaway. His car slowed rapidly and drifted safely toward the outside edge of the racing surface. Yellow caution lights immediately illuminated around the speedway, and drivers reduced their speed while safety crews prepared to assist. Nathan had been gaining positions steadily when the caution appeared. He easily could have continued toward the front of the pack by choosing the shortest route around the slowing traffic, but instead he backed off the throttle earlier than necessary, leaving generous space for the struggling driver to regain control and reach the designated safety area without additional pressure from the cars behind him. The decision cost Nathan several valuable positions as competitors slipped past before the caution fully organized the field. "Dad lost places," Emily whispered with concern. An older woman standing beside her smiled kindly. "Maybe." Emily continued watching the track before answering with quiet certainty. "He always says getting everyone home safely is more important than finishing first." Those simple words reached Claire, who happened to be standing only a few feet away. She looked toward Emily with a thoughtful expression before turning her attention back to the timing monitor. The telemetry confirmed exactly what she had suspected. Nathan had lifted off the throttle almost 300 feet earlier than necessary. Not because he lacked confidence, but because he had chosen responsibility over opportunity. When racing resumed several laps later, Victor immediately attacked once again, determined to rebuild his advantage. Nathan resumed exactly as before, never showing frustration over the positions he had surrendered. His steering remained smooth. His breathing remained steady. His lap times remained astonishingly consistent. The commentators began noticing the pattern. "Car number 27 may not be the fastest on any single lap," one remarked, "but he has quietly become one of the most consistent drivers on the track." Another announcer answered, "Sometimes discipline wins races long before speed does." As the Chevelle crossed the finish line to begin another lap, Claire lowered her headset and looked toward the old engineer who had recognized Nathan the previous evening. The elderly man simply smiled and spoke with complete confidence. "Now you understand why the greatest people in this sport respected him. It was never only about what he could build. It was always about the man making the decisions behind the wheel. By the halfway point, the race had quietly transformed into something very different from what the crowd had expected. The excitement of the opening laps had settled into a test of patience, judgment, and endurance. One by one, drivers who had pushed too hard began visiting pit lane for fresh tires or small mechanical adjustments. Others struggled with fading grip as the afternoon heat baked the racing surface until shimmering waves rose above the asphalt. Nathan Brooks continued circulating with the same measured rhythm that had puzzled spectators since qualifying. Every lap looked almost identical to the one before it, as though he had memorized not only the track, but every breath the Chevelle wanted to take. Emily followed each passing lap with growing confidence. She no longer counted positions. Instead, she watched her father's hands through the windshield whenever the car swept past the front straightaway. They never appeared. Hurried. They never fought the steering wheel. They simply guided the old Chevrolet with quiet trust. High above the speedway, Claire Bennett continued comparing live telemetry between the leading cars. Suddenly, one number caught her attention. Nathan's average lap time had remained nearly unchanged since the green flag, while nearly every other driver had slowed as tire wear increased. Her chief engineer leaned closer to the monitor. He built the entire setup around consistency, he said. Claire nodded slowly. He was never trying to be the fastest driver on lap 1. He planned to become the fastest driver when everyone else became tired. The realization spread through the engineering booth like a whispered secret. Down in the paddock, the elderly engine builder smiled to himself without saying a word. He had seen this philosophy decades earlier, when a young engineer named Nathan Brooks had quietly earned respect by proving that wisdom could outperform raw horsepower. Out on the track, Victor Hayes glanced into his mirror and noticed something unexpected. The dark blue Chevelle had begun closing the distance. Not dramatically, not aggressively, just a little closer each lap. Victor frowned. How is he doing that? He muttered inside his helmet. His crew radio crackled. Maintain your pace. You still have the advantage. Victor answered confidently, but uncertainty had already entered his thoughts. The next several laps only deepened the mystery. Nathan overtook one competitor after another with clean, patient exits from the corners rather than risky moves entering them. Every pass looked effortless because it had been prepared several turns in advance. One veteran commentator finally laughed with genuine admiration. Ladies and gentlemen, we may have misunderstood this entire race. Car number 27 is not chasing people. He is allowing them to wear themselves out. His broadcast partner answered. That is the mark of someone who understands machines at a deeper level. Emily heard the announcers through the nearby loudspeakers and smiled proudly. That sounds like my dad. As another caution-free lap unfolded, a faint vibration traveled through the Chevelle steering wheel. Nathan noticed it immediately. Most drivers would have ignored such a small change, but years of engineering had trained him to hear problems before they became failures. During the next scheduled pit window, he calmly guided the car onto pit road. There was no professional crew waiting with expensive equipment. Only Emily stood ready beside the worn blue toolbox exactly where they had practiced countless evenings at home. Nathan stepped out, removed the front wheel, made one careful adjustment to a suspension component no larger than his hand, checked the torque himself, and returned the wheel to the car in remarkably little time. Mechanics from neighboring teams watched in complete silence. None of them had expected a single father working with his daughter to perform such precise work under race conditions. Claire watched the entire stop from pit wall before quietly whispering to herself, he is not only driving the race. He understands every heartbeat inside that car. Moments later, Nathan restarted the engine, and the Chevelle answered with an even smoother note than before, causing several experienced crew chiefs to exchange stunned glances as they realized the real race was only beginning. The final quarter of the race unfolded beneath a sky turning softly amber as the afternoon sun drifted toward the western mountains. Shadows stretched across Blackstone Speedway, and with every passing lap the atmosphere grew quieter, almost as if thousands of spectators sensed they were witnessing something far greater than an ordinary race. Nathan Brooks eased the Chevelle back onto the racing line after the pit stop, and for the first time all day he allowed the engine to reveal what it had been patiently holding in reserve. The deep mechanical note that rolled across the speedway was no longer merely smooth. It carried quiet confidence, like an orchestra finally reaching the movement it had been building toward since the opening measure. Emily heard it immediately and smiled without taking her eyes off the track. "Now," she whispered. "Now he is ready." Claire Bennett folded her arms as the timing monitor refreshed again. Nathan's lap. Time suddenly dropped by nearly half a second. Another lap passed. They dropped again. Her chief engineer stared at the screen in disbelief. "He did not find more horsepower," he murmured. "He unlocked the balance." Claire nodded slowly. "He built the car to become stronger as everyone else became weaker." One by one, the cars ahead of Nathan began to disappear into his windshield. There were no desperate lunges into corners. No reckless moves. Every overtake came from cleaner exits, smoother acceleration, and remarkable patience. Drivers glanced in their mirrors expecting to defend against an attack, only to realize the old Chevelle had already slipped beside them with quiet precision before the next straightaway even arrived. The crowd gradually stopped cheering individual passes because there were simply too many to follow. Instead, a wave of astonished murmurs spread across the grandstands each time the familiar blue Chevrolet appeared one position higher on the scoring pylon. The commentators struggled to contain their excitement. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is extraordinary. Car number 27 has climbed from the middle of the field into the top three without forcing a single reckless maneuver." His broadcast partner answered almost reverently. "This is what mastery looks like when patience finally meets opportunity." Up ahead, Victor Hayes noticed the dark blue reflection growing larger inside his mirror. His confident smile disappeared for the first time all weekend. He pressed harder through the corners, searching for speed that had already slipped away with worn tires and mounting fatigue. Nathan, meanwhile, appeared almost unchanged. His steering remained steady. His breathing remained calm. The Chevelle seemed to float across the racing surface with effortless rhythm. As they entered the final 10 laps, Nathan moved into second place. The entire speedway rose to its feet. Even spectators who had laughed the day before now leaned silently against the fence, watching every movement with growing respect. Claire could hardly believe the numbers flashing across her screen. Nathan was producing the fastest laps of the entire event in a car everyone had dismissed before the green flag. The elderly engine builder quietly removed his hat once again. "I remember when people used to travel across the country just to study his designs," he whispered. "Today they are finally seeing why." 5 laps remained. Victor still led, but only by a few car lengths. Entering the long back straightaway, Nathan gently rolled into the throttle one final time. The Chevelle responded with a rich, perfectly balanced roar that echoed across the Montana Valley with breathtaking clarity. It was not harsh. It was not violent. It sounded like years of quiet discipline finding its voice at exactly the right moment. Conversation stopped throughout the grandstands. Mechanics lowered their tools. Photographers forgot to press their shutters. Claire closed her eyes for a brief second, recognizing the unmistakable sound she had been searching for since qualifying. When she opened them again, the old Chevelle was already drawing alongside the race leader, and an entire speedway stood frozen in complete silence, no longer watching an underdog, but witnessing the return of a legend. The final laps unfolded with a stillness that no one at Blackstone Speedway could have imagined when the day had begun. Nathan Brooks guided the old Chevelle beside Victor Hayes entering the long front straightaway, neither driver making a reckless move nor forcing the other into a mistake. Instead, Nathan waited until the exit of the final corner, where months of patient engineering and years of quiet experience came together in one perfectly measured moment. The Chevelle accelerated with calm authority, its balanced engine delivering power as smoothly as a sunrise spreading across the Montana hills. Inch by inch, the blue Chevrolet moved ahead. Victor glanced across and saw something that unsettled him more than losing the lead. Nathan was not celebrating. He was not smiling. He was simply focused, respectful, and completely at peace. As the white flag signaled the final lap, the grandstands remained almost unbelievably silent. Thousands of people who had laughed only a day earlier now watched without speaking, unwilling to miss a single heartbeat of what unfolded before them. Emily gripped the fence with both hands, her eyes glistening beneath the brim of her faded blue cap. She whispered the same words her father had told her countless evenings in their little garage. Smooth hands. Patient heart. Nathan entered the final corners exactly as he had entered every corner before them, never forcing the car beyond its limits, trusting preparation instead of emotion. The Chevelle flowed through the turns with effortless grace, and when it emerged onto the final straightaway, the finish line waited only a few hundred feet ahead. The checkered flag waved high above the track as Nathan crossed beneath it first. For one breathtaking moment, there was no explosion of cheers, no shouting, no celebration loud enough to overpower what everyone had just witnessed. There was only silence. It was the kind of silence that comes when pride gives way to respect, when assumptions collapse under the weight of truth, and when an ordinary-looking man quietly reminds the world that greatness rarely announces itself. Nathan completed one slow victory lap, raising only one hand from the steering wheel to wave toward the grandstands before returning both hands to the wheel. He drove directly to the pit lane where Emily was already running toward him. The moment he stepped from the Chevelle, she wrapped her arms around him with all the joy her small heart could hold. Nathan hugged her gently and whispered, "We did it together." Tears filled Claire Bennett's eyes as she approached carrying the winner's trophy. She stopped in front of Nathan and smiled with sincere admiration. "Years ago I studied your engineering papers because they changed the way I understood racing," she said quietly. "Today you reminded all of us that character matters even more than talent." Nathan accepted the trophy with humble gratitude before placing it into Emily's hands instead. "She earned this too," he said. "Every late night in the garage, every tool she handed me, every time she believed in me when nobody else did." Around them, mechanics, officials, and drivers slowly removed their hats. Even Victor Hayes walked forward, extending his hand with honest respect. Nathan accepted it without hesitation. There was no bitterness left between them, only the quiet understanding that true champions elevate everyone around them. As the evening sun painted the speedway in soft shades of gold, Nathan loaded the trophy into the back seat beside Emily, folded the same worn camping chair they had brought that morning, and closed the trunk of the old Chevelle. They drove slowly toward the exit while hundreds of people remained standing along the fence, watching until the familiar blue car disappeared beyond the final gate. Long after the sound of its engine faded into the distance, nobody hurried to leave. They had not simply watched a race. They had witnessed the quiet power of dignity, patience, and a father's unwavering love, proving that the strongest victories are never measured only by crossing a finish line, but by the respect a good heart earns without ever asking for it. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more stories of courage, kindness, and second chances, because the people the world overlooks often leave the greatest impact.